The battle for Maplewood Lane. The night was heavy with the kind of stillness that only a small Ohio town can muster, where the hum of crickets feels like the heartbeat of the world. But at 2 a.m., that peace shattered. I, Henry Caldwell, a retired mechanic pushing 68, jolted awake to an orange glow dancing across my bedroom window. Flames clawed at the glass, their crackling roar cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stumbled out of bed, the acrid stench of smoke filling my lungs. Through the window, I saw my backyard shed engulfed in fire, a tower of flame devouring everything inside. That shed held more than tools and old paint cans. It contained the only documents proving I owned my home. Deeds, titles, legal papers, the fragile paper trail that stood between me and losing the land my family had held for 3 generations. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling as I dialed 911, and ran outside in my worn pajamas, the cold grass biting my bare feet. The heat hit me like a wall, the fire's roar drowning out the operator's voice on the line. The shed, where I kept my wrenches and my late wife Clara's gardening tools, was a goner. By the time the fire trucks screeched into Maplewood Lane, their sirens waking the neighborhood, it was too late. The shed was a smoldering ruin, a black skeleton against the flickering embers. I stood there, hands trembling, watching 50 years of my life reduced to ash. Deep down, I knew this wasn't some freak accident. Someone wanted those papers gone, and I had a sinking feeling I knew who. My name's Henry Caldwell, and I've lived in this house on the edge of Maplewood Lane for most of my life. This place, with its creaky front porch, sprawling maple tree, and cedar fence my father built in the 70s, isn't just a house. It's a living memory of Clara's laughter as she planted roses, of our daughter Jenny chasing fireflies in the yard, of my father's quiet pride as he sank each fence post into the earth. After Clara passed 3 years ago, her absence left a hole nothing could fill, but this house became my sanctuary, a way to hold on to her. The fence, the tree, the worn steps, they weren't just things. They were us. But peace, I've learned, is a fragile thing when a homeowners association decides you're standing in their way. It all started with that fence. The Maplewood HOA, led by Evelyn Harper, a woman whose smile never reached her cold blue eyes, began sending letters about 6 months ago. They arrived in crisp white envelopes, each stamped with the HOA's logo, a stylized maple leaf that looked more like it belonged on a corporate letterhead than in a neighborhood of modest split levels and bungalows. Evelyn, always dressed like she was about to chair a garden club luncheon, signed every one with a flourish. The first letter was polite, almost syrupy, requesting I repaint the fence because it violated community aesthetic standards. I chuckled and tossed it into a drawer with the junk mail. That fence had weathered storms, blizzards, and decades of Ohio summers. It had character, not decay. It was my father's handiwork, and I'd be damned if I let some busybody in pearls tell me it wasn't good enough. But Evelyn wasn't the type to take a hint. The letters kept coming, each one sharper than the last. Then the fine started. $100 for unkempt lawn edges, as if my grass was staging a rebellion. $200 for a mailbox that wasn't their approved shade of taupe. Never mind that it had been there since Reagan was president. It felt like they were inventing rules just to target me. I'm on a fixed income, a pension from 30 years turning wrenches at the auto shop. These fines weren't chump change. They stung. But I ignored them, my stubborn streak kicking in. Clara used to tease me about it, her eyes sparkling like the lake at dusk. "Henry, that mule in you's gonna get you in trouble one day," she'd say, her voice warm with love. God, I missed her. That sparkle was gone, but her words stuck with me, a reminder to hold my ground. Then came the letter that made my blood run cold. It was late August, the cicadas screaming in the trees, when the mailman handed me a thick envelope. My hands, rough from years of grease and steel, shook as I tore it open. A $50,000 fine for the fence, with a threat of foreclosure if I didn't pay within 30 days. $50,000. I read it twice, then a third time, my pulse hammering in my ears. They wanted to take my Hamimi father's home, Clara's home, the place where Jenny took her first steps over a fence. My fists clenched, the paper crumpling in my grip. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. This was a land grab, plain and simple. Evelyn Harper and her HOA cronies thought they could bully an old widower into submission, sweep me aside like dust under a rug. What they didn't know was that I held a trump card, one they'd never seen coming. My father, a man of few words but deep wisdom, had ensured our family owned the only road into Maplewood Linnea, 1.3-mile stretch of asphalt that every resident used to get in and out of the neighborhood. The HOA, in their arrogance, assumed it was public property, maintained by the county. It wasn't. It was mine, deeded to my father in 1974 when he sold the surrounding land for the development and passed to me after he died. For 50 years, I'd let the neighborhood use it for free, no questions asked. But Evelyn had just lit a match, and I was ready to burn her plans to the ground. I called my old friend Tom Reynolds, a lawyer who'd once been my apprentice at the shop before he traded socket wrenches for a briefcase. Tom had a quick laugh and a sharper mind, the kind of guy who could spot a con from a mile away. When I laid out the situation, the fines, the foreclosure threat, the road nearly choked on his coffee. "Henry," he said, a grin spreading across his face, "they're trying to strong-arm you over a fence, and you own the only way into their precious gated community. This isn't a fight. It's a reckoning. Let's bury them in their own paperwork." Tom got to work digging into county records, pulling every zoning file and property map he could find. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA didn't let up. I started noticing a slick guy in tailored suits hanging around Evelyn James Carver, a real estate developer with a smile like a used car salesman and eyes like a hawk circling a wounded animal. My neighbor Ruth, a widow in her 70s with a garden full of prize-winning dahlias and a nose for trouble, caught James's BMW parked at Evelyn's house at odd hours. "Something's off, Henry," she warned, her voice low as we stood by her mailbox. "That man's trouble, and Evelyn's drinking whatever snake oil he's selling." Ruth wasn't wrong. Things got uglier fast. One evening, my border collie, Rusty, vanished. He'd been with me since Clara got sick, a loyal shadow who slept at the foot of my bed. I spent 12 frantic hours searching, my voice hoarse from calling his name into the empty woods behind Maplewood Lane. The next morning, a neighbor found him locked in an abandoned van a few blocks away, along with 2 other missing pets from the neighborhood. Rusty was scared but unharmed, his brown eyes wide with confusion. There was no proof, no fingerprints, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to break me, piece by piece. Then came the fire. As I stood watching the shed burn, the flames casting long shadows across my yard, a young police officer named Sarah Mitchell stayed behind after the fire trucks left. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I think I knew your daughter Jenny in high school. You fixed my dad's truck once, didn't you?" I nodded, a faint memory of a teenage girl with braces flickering in my mind. Sarah's face was kind but serious, her badge glinting in the moonlight. "This fire doesn't look accidental," she said. "The way it spread so fast, the intensity, it's suspicious. Was there anything valuable in that shed?" My stomach twisted. "Land deeds," I said quietly. "Proof I own a certain road." Sarah's eyes widened, a spark of understanding passing between us. "I hope you've got copies somewhere safe," she said, her tone careful. "I've called in the arson investigators, but these things take time." I nodded, my mind racing. That's when it hit me. Clara, always the practical one, had insisted we get a safe deposit box years ago after a break-in scare in the neighborhood. I hadn't thought about it in ages, but if those papers were anywhere, they'd be there. The next morning, I drove to the town's oldest bank, a brick building with a marble lobby that echoed like a cathedral. My hands were still shaky from the night before, the smell of smoke clinging to my clothes. The clerk, a kid who looked like he'd just graduated high school, led me to the vault. The steel door swung open with a groan, revealing our little box. Inside, beneath some old savings bonds and Clara's grandmother's pearl earrings, was a manila envelope with my name in her neat, elegant handwriting. My chest tightened as I pulled out the contents. The original deed to the Maplewood Lane access road, notarized in 1974, clear as day. Tucked behind it was a smaller sealed envelope, Clara's handwriting staring back at me. I opened it, my breath catching. A single sheet of paper, her words spilling out like a lifeline. "My dearest Henry, if you're reading this, the world's gotten rough, and you're looking for strength. Hold fast to your father's wisdom and never let anyone take what's yours. Your power isn't just in land, it's in your heart and the love we built. No fire can touch that. Always, Clara." Tears stung my eyes, blurring the words. The smoke, the threats, the fear, they all receded, like a tide pulling back from the shore. Clara's love was my shield, her foresight my sword. Evelyn Harper and her cronies had underestimated me, but they'd just woken a sleeping giant. Armed with the deed and Clara's words, I felt a fire of my own kindling. This wasn't just about saving my home anymore. It was about protecting everything my family had built, everything Clara and I had loved. I called Tom and told him about the deed. "We've got them, Henry," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "They've been playing checkers, and you're about to flip the board to chess." As I hung up, I looked out at the charred remains of the shed, the morning sun glinting off the wreckage. Evelyn thought she could burn me out. She was about to learn what happens when you poke a man with nothing left to lose. The days after the fire were a blur of ash and anger. My backyard smelled like a bonfire gone wrong, and the charred skeleton of the shed stood as a constant reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. But Clara's letter and the deed in my hands were like a shot of adrenaline. I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore, it was fighting for her, for my father, for every memory tied to this patch of Ohio dirt. Evelyn Harper and her HOA cronies had picked the wrong widower to mess with. Maplewood Lane was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where kids rode bikes until dusk and neighbors waved from their porches. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The HOA, under Evelyn's iron grip, had turned the place into a battlefield of petty rules and power plays. I'd always kept to myself, tending my garden and fixing up the house, but now I saw the cracks in the facade. Neighbors whispered about fines for unapproved flower beds or Christmas lights left up past January. Evelyn's reign was built on fear, and I was done playing her game. I met Tom Reynolds at his office downtown, a small space cluttered with law books and coffee mugs. He leaned back in his chair, glasses perched on his nose, as I slid the deed across his desk. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "is a grenade, and Evelyn's about to pull the pin without knowing it." He'd been digging into county records and found something juicy. James Carver, the slick developer cozying up to Evelyn, had filed preliminary zoning applications to reclassify my road and part of my property for a luxury community entrance. The plan was to bulldoze my fence, pave over my land, and build a gated archway to jack up property values and line their pockets. They'd been counting on me folding under the $50,000 fine. "They thought you'd roll over, Henry," Tom said, a glint in his eye. "But you've got the deed, and we've got proof of their scheme. This is fraud, plain and simple. We're going to hit them where it hurts." He pulled out a stack of documents, zoning filings, emails between James and county officials, even a sketch of the proposed entrance that looked like something out of a Vegas casino. It was all there, stamped and dated, a paper trail of greed. But the HOA wasn't slowing down. The letters kept coming, each one bolder than the last. One demanded I remove a birdhouse Clara had hung years ago because it clashed with neighborhood uniformity. Another tacked on $2,000 to the fine for ongoing noncompliance. My mailbox was starting to look like a filing cabinet for Evelyn's vendetta. I ignored them, but the stress was wearing me down. My blood pressure was through the roof, and I wasn't sleeping. Every creak in the house at night made me jump, wondering if another accident was coming. Ruth, my neighbor with the dahlias, became my eyes and ears. She'd always been sharp, the kind of woman who could spot a lie before it left your mouth. One afternoon, she shuffled over with a plate of oatmeal cookies and a worried look. "Henry, I saw James Carver at Evelyn's again last night," she said, her voice low. "They were in her driveway, whispering like they were planning a bank heist. And I heard Evelyn mention your name." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "They're up to something, and it ain't good." Ruth wasn't the only one noticing. Other neighbors started dropping hints, small, cautious comments about Evelyn's bullying. Tim, a young dad down the street, got slapped with a $500 fine for a basketball hoop in his driveway. Mrs. Larson, an elderly widow, was threatened with a lien for planting tulips that weren't HOA approved. The fear was palpable, but so was the resentment. People were fed up, but too scared to speak out. Evelyn had them all under her thumb, and James Carver was the muscle behind her smile. Then things took a darker turn. One evening, as I was grilling burgers on my patio, I heard a crash in the front yard. My heart leapt into my throat as I ran out, Rusty barking at my heels. My mailbox was smashed to pieces, the metal twisted like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. Scrawled across the pavement in chalk was a single word: pay. I stood there, fists clenched, the burger smoke still clinging to my clothes. This wasn't just intimidation, Anna Maria, it was a declaration of war. I called Sarah Mitchell, the police officer who'd stayed after the fire. She arrived within the hour, her patrol car pulling up quietly. She examined the mailbox, her flashlight cutting through the dusk. "This is escalation, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady but grim. "First the fire, now this. Whoever's behind it is getting desperate." She took photos and promised to push the arson investigation, but her words stuck with me. Desperate people do dangerous things. Watch your back. Sarah's warning rattled me, but it also steeled my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. This was about every neighbor who'd been bullied, every family who'd paid fines they couldn't afford. I started talking to people, quietly at first. Ruth invited me to her weekly bridge game, where a few older residents opened up about their own HOA horror stories. Tim stopped by to help me fix the mailbox, muttering about how Evelyn had threatened to fine his wife for a non-regulation stroller. Even Mrs. Larson, who rarely left her house, slipped me a note saying she'd seen James sneaking around my property line at night. The neighborhood was waking up, and I was starting to feel like the spark for a fire of our own. Tom and I spent hours strategizing. He drafted a letter to the HOA, demanding they retract the fines and threatening legal action for harassment and fraud. He also filed a complaint with the county zoning board, attaching James's shady applications. "We're not just playing defense, Henry," Tom said, his voice brimming with confidence. "We're going on the offensive. They want your land? Let's make them choke on their own greed." But the HOA struck back hard. A week after the mailbox incident, I got a new letter, this one hand-delivered by a courier in a suit. It upped the fine to $52,000 and set a deadline: pay by the end of the month, or they'd start foreclosure proceedings. My hands shook as I read it, the words blurring together. Foreclosure. The thought of losing Clara's home, of strangers walking through her garden, made my chest tighten. I sank into my armchair, Rusty nudging my hand with his wet nose. For a moment, I felt old, tired, outmatched. Then I pulled out Clara's letter again. "Your power isn't just in land, it's in your heart and the love we built." Her words were like a jolt of electricity. I wasn't done yet. I called Tom and told him about the new letter. "They're panicking," he said, almost gleeful. "They know we're on to them. This is their last gasp. We need to hit them at the next HOA meeting." That's where we dropped the bomb. The meeting was 2 weeks away, billed as an emergency session to address community violations. I knew it was a setup, Evelyn's chance to publicly crucify me and push the foreclosure through. But I was ready. Tom and I spent every evening preparing, gathering evidence, rehearsing what I'd say. Ruth rallied a few neighbors to show up, promising to pack the room with friendly faces. Sarah tipped me off that she'd be there, off duty but watching for any trouble. The stage was set, and I could feel the storm brewing. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch, the cool September air brushing my face, and looked out at the maple tree Clara loved. Its leaves were just starting to turn, flecks of gold against the dark. I thought about her, about my father, about every fight I'd faced in my life: Vietnam, Clara's cancer, the long nights in the shop keeping the lights on. I'd never backed down then, and I wasn't about to now. Evelyn thought she could burn me out, scare me off. She didn't know I was forged in tougher fires than hers. As dawn broke, I drove to the bank one last time, double-checking the deed and Clara's letter. I tucked them into my old leather briefcase, the one Clara gave me when I retired. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of every memory I was fighting for. The HOA meeting was at 7 p.m. at the community center, a bland building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs. I spent the day pacing, Rusty trailing me like he knew something big was coming. Ruth stopped by with a thermos of coffee and a pep talk. "You're not alone, Henry," she said, her eyes fierce. "We're all sick of Evelyn's nonsense. Give him hell." By 6:30, I was in my truck, the briefcase on the passenger seat. My palms were sweaty, my heart racing, but Clara's words echoed in my head. "Hold fast." I pulled into the community center parking lot, already packed with cars. Neighbors milled outside, their voices a low hum of anticipation. I stepped out, briefcase in hand, and felt the weight of every eye on me. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a showdown, and I was walking into it with the truth as my weapon. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. Folding chairs were packed wall to wall, the air thick with the scent of coffee and nervous sweat. Ruth was front and center, her arms crossed, staring daggers at the stage where Evelyn would soon take her throne. Sarah Mitchell stood near the exit, her civilian clothes not hiding the cop in her posture. I took a seat near the front, the briefcase on my lap, and waited. The clock ticked toward 7. I could feel the storm breaking, and I was ready to ride it. The community center was a pressure cooker, the air thick with whispers and the squeak of folding chairs. I sat near the front, my leather briefcase resting on my knees like a loaded gun. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the packed room. Neighbors filled every seat, some clutching coffee cups, others exchanging nervous glances. Ruth sat 2 rows ahead, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on the empty stage where Evelyn Harper would soon make her grand entrance. Sarah Mitchell, off-duty but alert, leaned against the back wall, her gaze sweeping the crowd. The clock on the wall ticked past 7 p.m., and the hum of anticipation grew louder. This wasn't just an HOA meeting, it was a trial, and I was the man in the dock. I'd spent the last 2 weeks preparing for this moment with Tom Reynolds, my lawyer and old friend. We'd gone over every detail: the deed to the Maplewood Lane access road, the zoning documents exposing James Carver's shady development plans, the escalating fines designed to break me. Tom had coached me to keep my cool, to let the evidence do the talking. "You're not just fighting for your house, Henry," he'd said, his voice steady. "You're fighting for everyone they've bullied. Make them see it." Clara's letter, tucked safely in my briefcase, was my anchor. Her words, "Your power isn't just in land, it's in your heart," kept me grounded, even as my pulse hammered in my ears. At 7:05, the room fell silent as Evelyn Harper strode in, her white blazer crisp enough to cut glass. She moved like a queen claiming her court, her heels clicking on the linoleum. James Carver trailed behind, his tailored suit and slicked-back hair screaming money, but his eyes darted nervously, like a man who knew the ground was shifting under him. Evelyn stepped to the podium, tapping the microphone with manicured nails, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Good evening, everyone," she purred, her voice smooth as honey but laced with venom. "Thank you for attending this emergency meeting to address a serious matter concerning Mr. Henry Caldwell's repeated violations of our community standards." The word violations landed like a slap. She launched into a litany of my supposed crimes. The cedar fence that didn't meet her aesthetic guidelines, lawn edges she deemed too wild, a mailbox that dared to be navy instead of taupe. The crowd stirred, some nodding smugly, folks like the Thompsons in the front row, who'd once fined a neighbor for a non-regulation birdbath, while others shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn's smile widened as she built her case, her words painting me as a stubborn old man dragging down property values. "These infractions, with accumulated penalties, now total $52,000, she announced, her voice ringing with triumph. "Mr. Caldwell has been given every opportunity to comply. Regrettably, we must now pursue foreclosure." A gasp rippled through the room. Foreclosure. The word hung heavy, a guillotine blade poised to drop. I saw Ruth's fists clench, her jaw tight. Tim, the young dad who'd fixed my mailbox, muttered something under his breath. Even Mrs. Larson, frail and quiet in the back, looked shaken. Evelyn pivoted toward me, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Mr. Caldwell, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" That was my cue. I stood slowly, my knees creaking but my spine straight. Every eye in the room locked onto me, the weight of their stares like a physical force. I set my briefcase on the table with a deliberate thud, the sound cutting through the tension like a gavel. "Evelyn," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry. "You talk a lot about standards and community, but I think it's time everyone here knows what you're really after." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease breaking her composure. "This isn't the place for theatrics, Henry," she snapped, but I was already moving. I clicked open the briefcase, the latches snapping like gunfire in the quiet room. I pulled out the original deed to the Maplewood Lane access road, holding it up like a flag. "This," I said, turning to face the crowd, "is the notarized 1974 deed to the only road into Maplewood Lane. It's not public. It's not HOA property. It's mine." The room erupted in murmurs, a collective inhale of shock. Someone in the back whispered, "What did he say?" I pressed on, my voice steady but burning with the anger I'd bottled up for months. For 50 years, my family has let this neighborhood use my road for free. No tolls, no complaints. But Evelyn and her friend here. I nodded toward James Carver, who was shrinking into his seat like he wished he could vanish, have been quietly planning to rezone my property and build a luxury entrance to boost their real estate scam. They thought they could force me out with trumped-up fines and threats. The murmurs grew louder, a tide of disbelief and outrage. I laid out the zoning documents Tom had uncovered, passing copies to Ruth and Tim to hand around. "These are James Carver's filings with the county," I said, pointing to the sketches of a gaudy gated entrance. "They planned to pave over my land, my home, without telling any of you. And when I wouldn't budge, when I got a lawyer and started fighting back, my shed mysteriously burned down, destroying what they thought was my proof." Evelyn's face was a mask of fury, her lips twitching. James tried to stand, stammering, "This is outrageous," but I cut him off. "Except they didn't get everything," I said, tapping the deed. "Thanks to my wife's foresight and a bank vault, I've got the original right here. And I've got something else, proof that this was never about a fence. It was about greed." I turned to the crowd, my voice softening but firm. "Folks, this isn't just about me. It's about every fine you've paid, every rule you've been scared to break. Evelyn's been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and James is her partner in crime. They wanted my land, and they didn't care who they hurt to get it." That's when Ruth stood, her voice trembling but fierce. "Henry's right," she said, her eyes blazing. "Evelyn's been bullying us for years. Fines for flower pots, threats over Christmas wreaths. It's never been about rules. It's about control." Tim jumped in, his voice raw. "They fined me $500 for a basketball hoop my kids love. I had to take a second job to pay it." Mrs. Larson, her hands shaking, added, "She threatened to lien my house over tulips." Tulips. The dam broke. Neighbors stood, one by one, sharing stories of petty tyrannies and unfair fines. The room was a powder keg, and I'd just lit the fuse. Evelyn's composure cracked. Her face went pale, her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might shatter. "This is absurd," she choked out, her voice shrill. "I've only ever acted in the community's best interest, but the crowd wasn't buying it." Boos and shouts drowned her out. James, sweating through his suit, tried to slip toward the exit, but Sarah Mitchell stepped in front of him, her expression saying, "Not so fast." Then it happened. Evelyn's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with panic. "It's not," she stammered, her other hand clutching her temple. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the stage, a heap of white blazer and desperation. The room exploded into chaos. Someone screamed. Neighbors surged forward, some to help, others just gawking. Sarah leapt onto the stage, checking Evelyn's pulse and barking into her radio for paramedics. I stood there, still holding the deed, my heart pounding but my mind clear. This wasn't triumph, it was justice, raw and messy. Paramedics arrived within minutes, wheeling Evelyn out on a stretcher. Sarah whispered to me as she passed, "She's conscious, but it looks like a mini-stroke. She's done calling the shots for a while." I nodded, a wry smile tugging at my lips. "Shame. I hear HOA queens get great retirement plans." James, seeing his scheme implode, tried to bolt, but a burly neighbor blocked the door, arms crossed. The crowd's mood had shifted, anger replaced fear, and they weren't letting anyone slink away. As the room calmed, I looked out at my neighbors. Ruth's eyes shone with pride. Tim gave me a nod, his shoulders squared for the first time in months. Mrs. Larson clutched her purse, a small smile on her face. I'd come to save my home, but I'd done something bigger. I'd given Maplewood Lane its voice back. Clara's words echoed in my head. "Your power is in the love we built." I'd protected that love, and in doing so, I'd set us all free. The community center was a haze of adrenaline and aftermath as the paramedics wheeled Evelyn Harper away. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows across the folding chairs, now scattered like leaves after a storm. Neighbors milled about, their voices a mix of shock, relief, and righteous anger. I stood near the stage, my leather briefcase still clutched in one hand, the deed to the Maplewood Lane access road safe inside. My heart was still racing, but a quiet calm settled over me. Clara's words, "Your power is in the love we built," felt like a steady hand on my shoulder. I'd come to save my home, but I'd done something bigger. I'd cracked open the cage Evelyn had built around Maplewood Lane. Sarah Mitchell, the off-duty cop who'd jumped into action, approached me as the crowd thinned. Her face was calm but tired, her ponytail slightly askew from the chaos. "Evelyn's stable," she said quietly. "Mini stroke, not life-threatening, but she's out of commission for a while. The hospital's keeping her for observation." I nodded, a dry chuckle escaping my lips. "Guess her reign's over. Hope they don't let her run the hospital ward like an HOA." Sarah smirked. Then her expression turned serious. "Henry, that was a hell of a move. You didn't just save your house, you exposed a scam. I'm pushing the arson investigation hard. The fire report's preliminary, but it's looking like accelerant was used. Someone wanted that shed gone." Her words hit like a punch. Accelerant. The fire wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a calculated strike. I thought of Rusty locked in that van, my smashed mailbox, the chalk-scrawled "Pay" on my driveway. Whoever was behind this wasn't just desperate, they were dangerous. "Keep me posted, Sarah," I said, my voice low. "And watch out for James Carver. He slithered out of here too fast." She nodded, her eyes sharp. "He's on my radar. Guys like him don't disappear, they regroup." James Carver had vanished in the chaos, slipping past the neighbor who'd blocked the door. Ruth, ever the hawk, swore she saw him peel out of the parking lot in his BMW, his face pale as a ghost. "That weasel's not done, Henry," she warned as we stood outside the community center, the night air cool against my skin. "He's got too much money tied up in this to walk away." I agreed, but for now, his absence felt like a small victory. The HOA's power had crumbled, and Maplewood Lane was breathing freer than it had in years. The next morning, I woke to a strange quiet. No letters in the mailbox, no fines tacked to my door. The neighborhood felt different, like a weight had lifted. I made coffee and sat on my porch, Rusty at my feet, watching the sun rise over the maple tree Clara loved. Its leaves were turning gold, a promise of autumn. I pulled out her letter again, tracing her handwriting with my finger. "Hold fast." I had, and it felt good, not like fireworks, but like the steady warmth of a fire you've tended yourself. But the fight wasn't over. Tom Reynolds called around noon, his voice crackling with energy. "Henry, you're the talk of the town. The county zoning board's launching an investigation into Carver's filings, thanks to the documents we sent. Fraud, misrepresentation, maybe even conspiracy if we can tie him to the fire. And get this, the HOA board's imploding. 2 members resigned this morning, and the rest are scrambling to distance themselves from Evelyn." I could hear the grin in his voice. "You didn't just win a battle. You started a revolution." Tom wasn't exaggerating. By afternoon, neighbors were knocking on my door not with complaints, but with gratitude. Tim, the dad with the basketball hoop, brought his kids over with a 6-pack of beer and a handshake. "You gave us our neighborhood back, Henry," he said, his voice thick. "I was working overtime to pay those fines. Now my kids can play without me worrying about a rulebook." Mrs. Larson shuffled over with a tin of homemade fudge, her eyes bright. "I'm planting more tulips next spring," she declared. "And they're going to be red, not beige." Even the Thompsons, the HOA loyalists who'd nodded along at Evelyn's speech, left a note on my porch. "We didn't know about the land grab. Sorry, Henry. We were wrong." Ruth, of course, was the ringleader. She showed up with a thermos of coffee and a plan. "We're done with HOAs, Henry," she said, her voice fierce. "No more fines, no more queens. Let's form a neighborhood council, volunteers, no power trips. We'll plan potlucks, fix potholes, look out for each other. What do you say?" I smiled, picturing Clara's grin at the idea. "Count me in, Ruth. But no taupe mailboxes, deal?" She laughed, and for the first time in months, I felt like Maplewood Lane was ours again. The arson investigation picked up steam. Sarah called a few days later with an update. "We've got a lead," she said, her voice cautious but hopeful. "A gas can found in the woods near your property. Prints on it don't match anyone local, but we're cross-checking with known associates of Carver. And get this, one of Evelyn's emails to him, leaked by a former HOA member, mentions taking care of the shed problem. It's not a smoking gun, but it's close." I thanked her, my mind racing. If we could tie Carver to the fire, he'd be facing more than a failed death, be looking at jail time. Meanwhile, I had to deal with the road. Owning the only way into Maplewood Lane was a double-edged sword. I'd never wanted to lord it over anyone, but I needed to protect myself. Tom helped me draft a lease agreement. $1 a year for the neighborhood to use the road, renewable at my discretion, with the money going to a community fund for park maintenance. It was symbolic, but it sent a message. This was my land, and I wasn't going anywhere. I presented it at a makeshift meeting in Ruth's backyard, where neighbors sipped lemonade and nodded approval. No tolls, no gates, I said, holding up the agreement. Just neighbors being neighbors. The applause was small but heartfelt, and I felt Clara's presence in the warmth of it. The fence was next. The old cedar posts, weathered but sturdy, were still standing, but the fire had scorched parts of it. I decided to rebuild, not because the HOA demanded it, but because it was my father's legacy. Tim and his kids showed up to help, along with a few other neighbors. Young Joey, Tim's 10-year-old, wielded a hammer like he was born to it, grinning as we set new posts. Ruth brought scones and coffee, turning the work into a community event. As we worked, I caught neighbors driving by, waving or honking in support. The fence wasn't just what Anna Maria was, a symbol of what we'd won. But James Carver wasn't done. A week after the meeting, Sarah called with a warning. "Carver's been spotted in town," she said. "He's meeting with some out-of-state investors, probably trying to salvage his deal. Stay sharp, Henry. He's cornered, and cornered animals bite." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I started locking my doors at night, something I hadn't done in years. Rusty stayed closer, his ears pricking at every sound. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I was ready. The final blow came unexpectedly. Sarah and the arson team got a break. A security camera from a nearby gas station caught a man matching Carver's description buying a gas can the day before the fire. His BMW was parked in the lot, license plate clear as day. The prints on the can matched a known associate of his, a lowlife with a rap sheet for petty crimes. "We're bringing him in for questioning," Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement. "If he flips, Carver's done." By the end of the week, the associate had spilled everything. Carver had paid him to torch my shed, hoping to destroy the deed and scare me into selling. The police issued a warrant for Carver's arrest, but he'd already skipped town. His investors, smelling trouble, pulled out, leaving his luxury entrance dream dead in the dirt. Evelyn, recovering in the hospital, faced her own reckoning. The leaked email tied her to the fire, and while she avoided criminal charges, the county slapped her with fines for ethics violations. The HOA dissolved, its accounts frozen pending an audit. Neighbors cheered when the news broke, some even throwing an impromptu block party. Ruth hung a banner across her garage, "Maplewood Lane, free at last." I stood on my porch one evening, the new fence nearly finished, its cedar scent filling the air. The neighborhood was alive, kids playing, neighbors chatting over fences, flowers blooming without fear of fines. I framed Clara's letter, the deed, and a photo of my father by the original fence, hanging them in my living room. They weren't just relics, they were proof of what we'd fought for. Maplewood Lane wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. The autumn sun hung low over Maplewood Lane, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and crimson. My new cedar fence stood proud, its fresh wood gleaming under the afternoon light, a testament to the fight I'd won. I, Henry Caldwell, stood on my porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, watching kids race their bikes down the street. Rusty lounged at my feet, his tail thumping lazily. The air felt lighter, not just because of the crisp September breeze, but because Maplewood Lane was free. Evelyn Harper's reign was over, James Carver was a fugitive, and the HOA was a memory. But as I looked out at the maple tree Clara loved, I knew this wasn't just about winning, it was about rebuilding, about making sure the scars of the past didn't define our future. The weeks following the chaotic HOA meeting were a whirlwind of change. The neighborhood council Ruth proposed took shape faster than I'd expected. She organized the first meeting in her backyard, stringing fairy lights, and setting out folding tables piled with casseroles and pies. Neighbors showed up in droves, Tim with his kids, Mrs. Larson with her fudge, even the Thompsons, who kept their heads low but brought a decent potato salad. Ruth stood on a milk crate, her voice carrying over the chatter. "No presidents, no fines," she declared. "Just us, working together for potlucks, park cleanups, whatever we need." "Who's in?" Hands shot up, and for the first time in years, I saw Maplewood Lane smile as one. I presented the road lease at that meeting, the $1 a year agreement Tom had drafted. "This road's yours to use," I said, holding up the paper. "Always has been. But it's my family's land, and I'm keeping it that way. The dollar goes to a fund for the park, maybe a new swing set for the kids." The crowd clapped, Tim's son Joey cheering loudest. I signed the lease right there, passing it around for witnesses. It wasn't about control. It was about trust, something Evelyn had never understood. Clara would have loved if her practical heart always leaned toward community, not conquest. The arson case closed with a thud. Sarah Mitchell called one crisp morning, her voice a mix of triumph and exhaustion. "Carver's associate took a plea deal," she said. "He gave us everything: texts, payments, even a voicemail from Carver ordering the shed hit. We've got an arrest warrant out, but Carver's gone to ground, probably out of state. His investors are suing him, and his company's bankrupt. He's finished, Henry." I thanked her, a weight lifting off my chest. The gas can, the security footage, the associate's confessionate was enough to prove the fire was no accident. Evelyn's leaked email, while not enough for charges, sealed her fate in the court of public opinion. She'd left the hospital and moved to a condo across town, her name a whisper of disgrace. The HOA's collapse was final. The county audit uncovered years of mismanagement, petty cash siphoned for Evelyn's community events that were mostly her garden parties, fines funneled to questionable accounts. The remaining board members scattered, one leaving a handwritten apology on my doorstep. "Didn't know about the land deal. Thought it was just rules. Sorry, Henry." I tossed it in the trash. Apologies don't erase years of bullying, but I wasn't one for grudges. Clara always said holding hate was like drinking poison and expecting the other guy to die. I let it go for her. Rebuilding the fence became a neighborhood project. Tim and Joey showed up most weekends, hammering posts with a rhythm that reminded me of my father. Ruth brought coffee and her famous apple scones, turning work into a social hour. Even young kids pitched in, carrying boards or painting stakes. One afternoon, Mrs. Larson shuffled over, her walker clicking on the pavement, and handed me a red tulip bulb. "For Clara's garden," she said, her voice soft. "Plant it deep, Henry. She'd want it to grow strong." I did, right by the maple tree, and when I patted the soil, I felt Clara's presence, steady and warm. The neighborhood changed in small, beautiful ways. Tim's basketball hoop stayed up, his kids' laughter echoing down the street. Mrs. Larson planted her red tulips, a defiant splash of color against her beige siding. The Thompsons, to their credit, started waving again, their smugness replaced by quiet humility. Ruth's council organized a fall festival, complete with a chili cook-off and a bounce house for the kids. I manned the grill, flipping burgers while Joey and his friends darted around, their faces sticky with cotton candy. It wasn't perfecto places, but it was ours, a community built on respect, not fear. I framed Clara's letter, the deed, and a faded photo of my father by the original fence, hanging them above my fireplace. They weren't trophies. They were reminders of what mattered: family, integrity, the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. Every time I looked at them, I heard Clara's voice. No fire can touch that. She was right. The fire had taken my shed, but it couldn't touch what I carried inside. One evening, as the first frost dusted the grass, Ruth stopped by with a thermos and a question. We sat on my porch swing, the creak of it a familiar comfort. "Henry," she said, her eyes searching mine, "why didn't you just sell? You could have walked away with a fortune and left this mess behind." I sipped my coffee, the steam curling in the air. "This house, this land, it's not just mine. It's Clara's, my father's, Jenny's. Selling would have been like selling them. Besides, someone had to stand up. If not me, who?" Ruth nodded, her face softening. "You woke us up, Henry. We were sleepwalking, letting Evelyn run the show. Now we're alive again." She squeezed my hand, and we sat in silence, watching the stars peek through the maple's branches. It wasn't victory, I felt, not the chest-thumping kind. It was peace, the kind that comes when you've fought for what's right and come out whole. Maplewood Lane moved on. The road stayed open, just a stretch of asphalt. Neighbors drove without a second thought. But something lingered, a lightness, a sense of possibility. Kids played louder, gardens bloomed brighter, and conversations over fences lasted longer. The council planned a spring cleanup, and Tim was already sketching a new playground for the park. I kept my doors unlocked again, Rusty sleeping soundly at night. The threats were gone, the shadows lifted. As winter loomed, I stood in my yard, the new fence complete. It was cedar, like my father's, built to last. I planted another tulip bulb by the maple, whispering, "For you, Clara." The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I'd fought a quiet rebellion, not with shouts or fists, but with paper, patience, and the stubborn love of a man who'd had enough. Evelyn wanted control, but she forgot real power comes from respect, earned through actions, not fear. Clara knew that, and now, so did Maplewood Lane. I don't call myself a hero. I'm just a man who protected his home, his memories, his people. But maybe that's enough. Maybe standing up, even when it's hard, is what keeps a community alive. Maplewood Lane isn't just a place, Anna Marie, it's a promise, one we'll keep together. Thank you for joining Henry's fight for Maplewood Lane. This story is about more than a fence or a road. It's about standing up to injustice, protecting what matters, and rebuilding community. What do you think? Have you faced bullying or unfair rules in your own life? Do you believe Henry's approach, quiet strength and truth, was the right way? Or should he have fought harder, maybe even with force? Share your thoughts in the comments below, especially on the themes of battling injustice and confronting greed. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your stand.